So welcome everyone to the SNAPP seminar series. Today we are very happy to have Daniel Freund from MIT joining us. So Daniel is currently assistant professor of operations management at MIT Sloan School of Management. He received his PhD in applied math at Cornell and then spent a year as a research fellow at Lyft Marketplace Labs, actually. And his current research applies market design, stochastic modeling, and optimization to problems in transportation, online platforms, and then revenue management, among others. His research has been recognized with many awards, including the Informs Applied Probability Society Best Publication Award and the George Danzig Dissertation Award, as well as a Daniel Wagner Prize for Excellence in Operations and Analytics. And many others as well. So it's our great pleasure to welcome Daniel. So Daniel, please. And today he's going to talk about efficient decentralized multi-agent learning in asymmetric bipartite query systems. My bad. Yeah.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. The SNAPP seminar series has featured a fantastic lineup in the past few years, so it's really a great honor for me to have the opportunity to present here today. I'll be talking about joint work with my MIT colleague Theodoros Lykoris and our joint PhD student Wentao Wang. This work appeared at COLD last year and is currently under review for journal publication. Wentao was the driving force in obtaining the results, so it's good news for me that he's actually in the room with me. He'll be monitoring the chat. If there are any questions, you can put them in the chat at any time, and he can interrupt me when he thinks that I'm really missing out on mentioning things. Wentao was selected for this work as a finalist for the Applied Probability Society student paper competition. And yeah, that's basically the preamble. Before I jump into the actual work, let me spend one slide giving you a bit of an idea of where this fits into my broader research focus. So most of my work has been on online platforms and mobility, and sometimes this intersects with applied probability. Recently, I've also been somewhat more interested in sort of pure applied probability topics that don't directly necessarily fit into the online platforms and mobility setting. And that's where today's talk, I think, also fits in. There's also some ongoing work that Wentao, Theodoros, and I are continuing to work on in the broader context of learning and queuing. And that, I would say, falls sort of into the non-intersection part of this research focus. Now, to get to the punchline as quickly as possible, let me start by defining what we mean by bipartite queuing systems for the purpose of this talk. Looking at the set of participants in this talk, I don't think this will be news for many people, but let's go over it once anyway. So we consider a bipartite queuing system that looks as follows. We have discrete time periods, and at the beginning of each time period, each agent or queue, we will use agents and queues interchangeably as vocabulary. Each agent obtains a new job with probability lambda I. So a queue I has an arrival rate of jobs of lambda I. And then the agent selects at most one server J to send a job to. So we have our K servers here on the right-hand side, and our agents select a server to send a job to. And then the server picks at most one agent to work on their job from the agents that have actually sent a job to them. And jobs that are not served, either because they were not selected or because they were not completed, jobs are only completed with probability mu ij, those jobs return to the queue that sent them. So let me show this sort of graphically, because that will make it a bit clearer. We have our n queues on the left-hand side. At the beginning of each period, each agent receives a new job with some probability lambda I. Those jobs enter the queue, and the queue then decides on a server to send the job to. Those are marked in orange here. So you can see the third queue is the only one that picks server 2, but the first two queues both pick server 1. Now, at this point, the servers each pick the agent whose job they're going to work on. So server 1 decided to work on the job from Q1. Server 2 decided to work on the job from Q3. And now with probability mu ij, that job gets completed. So server 1 decided to work on the job from Q1, but that job did not get completed. Server 2 completed the job that was sent by Q3. So the jobs go back to Q1 and 2, but the job of Q3, that one is completed and that one leaves the system. And that would be the end of the period. So this is the type of bipartite queuing system that we'll look at today. And you can think of this as representative for wide variety of models, including ones in healthcare, call centers, all types of service systems, communication networks, and so forth. Oftentimes in the literature, one would think about such a system from a centralized perspective, where there's a central decision maker, and that central decision maker has full knowledge of system parameters, in particular of the lambda i's, of the queue lengths, of the mu ij's. Today, we will assume that there's a decentralization between the different agents and that the agents don't have knowledge of those parameters. Let's make a bit more precise what we mean by that. So decentralization means that we will allow no communication among the agents. And the only real communication that occurs in the requests that the agents make to servers and in the feedback that the agents observe from the servers. And then there's the learning part, where we assume that our agents also do not have knowledge of the arrival rates and the service rates. So at the beginning of time, they can learn these rates, and they will, but at the beginning of time, everything that is sort of marked in purple right now is a priori unknown. And the question that we will be interested in is, given the setup, can we do roughly as well as we could do if we were a centralized planner with full knowledge of the system parameters? What do we mean when we say, can we do as well as if we were a centralized planner? Well, the objective that we will be interested in is stability. So stability means that our queues should not grow arbitrarily. So if we define our objective of t as the time averaged queue length, then we want the time average expected queue length, to be bounded by some constant that does not depend on t. It may depend on n and k, on other system parameters, but not on the time horizon. Now, such stability is not always possible, even centrally. So in particular, we need to ensure that our servers have enough capacity to serve the incoming demand, even if a central decision maker was routing them. And this is captured through what's called the traffic slackness of our system. That is, we need a weighted version of Hall's condition to hold true, meaning there should exist some phi j in the matching polytope, meaning phi j's are bounded between 0 and 1. For every I summing over j, phi j is at most 1. For every j summing over I, phi j is at most 1. Such that for any agent I, it holds that 1 plus epsilon times lambda I is at most sum over j, phi j, mu ij. The way you should think about this is that if everything was to happen as an expectation, both the arrivals and the service rates, then it should be the case that there's enough capacity in the system to serve all of the incoming jobs, even if the incoming jobs were amplified by a factor of 1 plus epsilon. So epsilon is what we will call the traffic slackness. And under this condition, it is possible for a central decision maker with knowledge of the arrival rates to stabilize the system. What we want to know is, can we achieve stability with decentralized learning in an asymmetric systems when epsilon is greater than 0, meaning when it would be possible centrally. Now, with this setup, are there any questions so far?
Can I think about a concrete setting where this may apply, where the agents, they don't, I have to make decentralized decision and then I don't know the parameters.
Yeah, I think if you think about plenty of sort of service systems, you will find agents that can't really coordinate. So if you think about any sort of online platform, it would be the case that agents are not necessarily in coordination. One difference is, in our setting, we will assume that the agents are collaborating. So if you think about being on an online platform, if you think of being on an online labor market, you're trying to get somebody to do work for you. At that point, you don't really care about stability of the overall system. So that is a distinction. But you do have the decentralized decision-making aspect. And you also don't necessarily know a priori the system parameters, because you don't know which server is which worker on the other side of the market is how efficient at doing your jobs. So that would be
okay. Also, how crucial is the assumption that the mu-ij's are different, or in meaning that kind of they're arbitrary, depending on I and j.
I mean, we don't need them to be different. If they are the same, that's totally fine by us.
Okay.
Yeah. This is only more general, basically.
Okay.
Okay.
Another question.
Yeah.
Is there a reason? So in this case, you said that if in a single period, the job doesn't get finished, it returns to the queue. Is this just to make the analysis easier, so you don't have to track like how much is left, or like it would be different if it like commits to that job and serves it until it's done, if it may take multiple periods?
I'm leaning towards that would actually be easier. So the decentralization aspect sort of becomes difficult in part because of this. So a key feature of the model is that when the job gets returned, I should have made this maybe clearer in this moment. When the job gets returned to Q1 and Q2, from the perspective of Q1 and Q2, it is the same setting. So Q1 had its job basically be selected, and it just didn't get served. Q2 did not have its job selected. So if you think about sort of the dynamics, it's really different, right? Because Q1 at least had a chance to have its job completed. Q2 did not. A key difficulty for us is that those two are observed in the same manner on the agent's part. If you have any experience working with contractors, I actually think this is sort of the real experience that one has when working with contractors, which is you send a job, you send a job, you send a job, and the job, you never get feedback about whether the job is done until the contractor says, okay, I'm going to be there in 1 hour and I'm going to fix your faucet. So that is sort of the mindset you should think about with respect to the feedback that agents receive.
So could you elaborate a bit on the fact that they're collaborating here, the different agents?
Let me get to that, okay? With respect to like what is allowed and what isn't allowed, and to how do they collaborate? Let me get to that.
Yes, and why not an equilibrium analysis instead?
So yeah, I will get to that as I talk about related work. So let me do exactly that right now. So there are sort of two related streams that are closely connected to what we're interested in. The one is on decentralization in communication networks. And there we are interested in efficient decentralized algorithms, where usually the system parameters are already assumed to be known. Sort of the one that we would want to have usually would be max weight. That works in networks that are much more complicated than our bipartite systems, and it guarantees maximum stability and also other nice features, including polynomial queue length. However, it is not decentralized, and in arbitrary networks, it's also not efficiently implementable. Then there are various variations, all of which achieve decentralization and are efficiently implementable, but either do not achieve maximum stability or do not achieve polynomial queue length, and don't necessarily adhere to our strict version of what we would allow with respect to no communication due to decentralization. And achieving all of these is actually not possible efficiently under standard complexity theoretic assumptions. So relative to this line of work, you can view ours as fulfilling everything, but only in the very special case of bipartite networks. And then there's related work on decentralization with learning. Let me start with the work of Jason Gertande and Eva Tadeusz with selfish agents, which gets closest to what Ali is asking about. So they consider a decentralized system. They basically consider the sort of selfish agents that are only interested in the outcome that they themselves achieve. And they show that this does not give maximum stability, meaning there are settings where there is enough capacity to serve everybody, but because agents are selfish, the queue lengths blow up. Now, one question that arises from that is, well, what if agents are decentralized, but they're not selfish? So they are willing to follow some protocol, but they cannot communicate in that protocol. So that would be the setting that we study. That is also the setting studied sort of, I would say, by Centenac and co-authors. And yeah, relative to that line of work, you sort of have the properties decentralization, which we have, the arbitrary service probabilities, which we have, which aren't always there in the literature, the maximum stability, which is achievable under non-selfish agents, and the polynomial queue length. So Ali, does that answer your question on? Yeah, okay, fantastic. So what is our result? We design an algorithm, which we call DAM-UCB, that has bounded time average queue length if all agents follow it for arbitrary unknown service probabilities, where the queue length will depend on the traffic slackness. The algorithm DAM-UCB is based on two pieces. The first is DAM, decentralized auction mechanism. And this is a decentralized way for agents to approximate a maximum weight matching. And the second part is to incorporate learning, to incorporate upper confidence bound UCB exploration into this decentralized auction mechanism. Now, one thing that our work does is it explores the direction suggested by earlier work of Krishnasamy and co-authors that were interested in the efficiency of adaptive exploration for learning in queues. And this was considered then in a centralized setting. And we show in our decentralized setting some provable advantages of adaptive exploration. In particular, you can extend our model to a dynamic one where agents dynamically join and leave. So you have queues that are there initially, but they might leave after some periods. You have queues that join at some point during the horizon and then leave later. So you have queues that are not static. And in that setting, we show that DAM with forced exploration, which is sort of an alternative way of incorporating learning into our setting, DAM with forced exploration cannot stabilize such a system, whereas DAM-UCB can. And in that way, we show that there's a provable advantage of using adaptive exploration in our queuing-based setting. Okay, let's clarify a few assumptions that we do or don't want to allow. So all of the blue ones we want to allow, and we will use at various points. One, agents share a common clock. So if you think about decentralization, maybe you don't want to assume a common clock, but for our purposes, we will have an algorithm that is based on epochs, and we basically need to make sure that every agent knows when an epoch begins. So periods are time indexed, and everybody always knows what time it is. The agents know a lower bound on the traffic slackness. They need not know it exactly, but they need to know some lower bound on it. They also need to know a lower bound on the minimum positive value that μij could take. And fourth, when agents make a request, they can make the request with an arbitrary scalar bit, and the server will select the maximum such bit. Now, this is a bit more flexible than what you have in the literature. So if you look at the existing words, for example, Gaetanda and Tadosh, they consider bits that are effectively the age of the job. So then one would just basically a bit the current period minus when the job appeared. Centenac et al. Consider the youngest first, then the bit would be the current time minus the age. We can capture any of these, and that gives us a bit more flexibility in allowing for arbitrary bits to go in. At the same time, there are some things that we don't want to allow. In particular, we don't want to allow agent identities. We don't want agents to basically know I'm agent 2, this other agent is agent 2, is agent 4, and in a given period, based on our identities, we act in a particular way. We don't want to allow shared randomness, and we don't want to allow observing each other's actions. Okay, now, within these assumptions, how do we obtain our algorithm? What we really strive for would be to implement centralized max weight. So what would that mean? That would mean in each period, we find a matching between queues and servers that maximizes the length of the queues multiplied by the service rates along the matching that we identify. And if we did that, we would know that we have all the nice properties that we could possibly ask for. We would have maximum stability, we would have polynomial queue length. The problem is, it's a centralized algorithm. And to get around that, we introduce what we will call the decentralized auction mechanism, which will operate in epochs, where at the beginning of each epoch, we will converge to an approximate maximum weight matching. And then we will just stick with that matching throughout the remainder of the epoch. The problem in achieving such an approximate maximum weight matching is that we require our agents to basically bid something that looks like the weight in max weight, meaning their queue length multiplied by mu ij. And even that we can't do if we assume that our system parameters need to be learned. So in order to get around that, we will show that DAM is amenable to unbiased sample collection, and that allows us to basically overlay UCB on top of it. Let's first talk about the decentralized aspect, meaning let's first talk about how can we decentrally approximate the maximum weight matching, assuming that we know the service rates. Notice that this is still non-trivial because each agent, even if they know the service rates, each agent only knows their own QI. They do not know the other queue's queue length, and those queue lengths change over time. Sorry. So the idea is, as I mentioned, an epoch algorithm where we require that the agents share the same clock so they know when the epoch starts. And at the beginning, we will converge to an approximate maximum weight matching, and then we will just stick to it. So what we need to make sure is, in whatever way we converge to it, afterwards, we need to make sure that we stick to it for long enough. Because if we were to converge to an approximate max weight matching and then just have one period with it, then the cost of converging to it would be too high. It wouldn't really pay off to actually try to converge to it. So that's the first part. This requires that we know a lower bound on the traffic slackness, because we need to make sure that we sort of stick to it for long enough once we've converged. And the second thing we need to do is we need to make sure that in converging, we sort of converge to the right thing. And what does that mean? It means that we can't have our dynamic queues sort of get in the way, because maybe at the beginning of an epoch, the maximum weight matching would have me matched to some server. But then, because more jobs arrive, suddenly I should be unmatched. That is perfectly possible. But in order to avoid that, we will just take the queue length at the beginning of the epoch as the proxy for what the queue lengths are being considered to be as throughout the convergence part. So what does that mean? Well, one thing it means is that if the epoch is really long, then qi of t naught would not actually be a good proxy for what the queue length of I is at the end of the epoch. So we need our epochs to be long enough for the first condition to hold, meaning for the maximum weight matching to actually pay off, the approximate maximum weight matching, but short enough for the approximate max weight matching to still be approximately max weight, meaning the queue lengths to still be good proxies. Okay, so how do we actually converge? So the idea being, if we were to converge, then we would know how long roughly we need to stick to it. But how do we converge? To do so, we adopt what's called the auction mechanism, developed by Bertzekers independently, and Demange, Gale, and Sotomayor. And let me first describe it centrally, and then we will discuss how we adapt it to a decentral version. So as a central algorithm, it really is just an algorithm to identify an approximate maximum weight matching that works as follows. We iteratively pick an unmatched agent and try to match it to his favorite server. What is the favorite server? The favorite server is the one that maximizes the difference between the weight along that edge and the price of the server. Initially, all prices are zero, so the price of the server here is zero. And the weights, if you think about it, both mu's are equal to 1. Server 1 has a queue length of 2, so the weight is 2. Server Q2 has a queue length of 1, so the weight is 1. So initially, we pick Q1 and we match Q1 to the server. And then we find an unmatched queue, in this case, Q2, and match it to the server. And at that point, Q1 becomes unmatched, and the server's price is incremented by some hyperparameter beta. So whenever another node takes over a server, the price of that server goes up by this hyperparameter. Now, at this point in time, server 1 is unmatched again. The server is the favorite of agent 1. So we match agent 1 back to the server. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, we're just going to alternate, except for once an agent is in a position where no server gives positive utility, utility being the difference between weight and price, we stop matching that queue. So at this point in time, the price of the server would be $1.20, and the utility of Q2 would just be $1. So that queue now drops out. And the matching that we converge to is the one that remains when there's no agent left, no queue left, that is both unmatched and has servers with positive utility. So once these are all gone, you have some matching, and that is the matching that you return. That very clearly is a central matching mechanism. And there are sort of two pieces that are tricky in extending it to our decentralized queuing problem. One is we don't have shared prices. And the other is agents do not know if they are matched. Because going back to Christina's earlier question, when an agent does not receive service, this could be due to interference with other agents, meaning that they were not matched, or it could just be due to randomness in the service probabilities. Now, how do we get around this? By developing a decentralized version that does the following. we first use the assumptions that agents can request service with an arbitrary bid. And in particular, we'll let each agent basically bid their weight on their favorite server. And how do they determine their favorite server? Well, rather than having a shared price, which we can't implement at this point because that would require communication, rather than bidding the shared price, every agent maintains an estimate of the price of every server. So agents maintain their own price for each server and bid their weight on the favorite. Servers always select requests with the highest bid. And by repeating requests often enough, we can distinguish between interference and randomness in service probabilities. Notice this requires knowing the lower bound on mu_i_j. So in that way, basically, you can think of each period as being amplified into, let's say, 8 periods. And if over 8 periods, I do not receive service from a particular server, and if the lower bound on mu_i_j, let's say, is 1/2, at that point, I can be pretty confident that it's not just because of service probabilities, it is just that I just haven't been selected by that server. In that way, we can decentrally converge to an approximate max weight matching. In particular, we converge to a 1 minus alpha max weight approximation after roughly k² divided by alpha periods. And that sort of wraps up the decentralized auction mechanism part. And the second part will then be, how do we incorporate learning on top of that? Do we have questions on this?
Can you elaborate a bit about the estimate for a bid price that each agent maintains?
Yeah, so basically, what were we doing in the centralized version? In the centralized version, each time a queue is removed from a server, the price of the server goes up. So in a decentralized version, what we basically do to adapt that is, if I'm a queue matched to a given server, my price for that server will go up when I am being removed. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Okay. So the decentralized auction mechanism still requires agents to bid their weight, which is wij equal to the queue length times the service rate. But we assume that, or like we want to be able to handle the case where the service rate is unknown. So we would like to learn mu_i_j in order to actually be able to implement this. Now, a challenge in decentralized learning is that it's sort of difficult to coordinate forced exploration. So in a centralized setting, we would just have explore rounds. And in those explore rounds, we select a matching that helps us estimate parameters. And centrally, that is very simple. In a decentralized setting, that requires all agents to agree on an exploration protocol. And also, at least in the way this was done by Centenac and co-authors, the agents afterwards want to run the same optimization program to implement a schedule of matchings. And in order to do that, it needs to be ensured that sort of the parameters of the system need to be estimated with very high accuracy. In particular, sort of an error that needs to be exponentially small in the number of servers. So what we would like to do is sort of to avoid several of these aspects. First of all, the exploration protocol requires a lot of prior communication and shared randomness. And those are things that we didn't really want to allow when we talked about decentralization. So in one way, such an exploration protocol, for example, includes identities And that is one way that we did not want to allow in a decentralized system. Second, the very high accuracy estimation leads to queue lengths that are exponential in Q. So that is also in K. That is also something that we would like to avoid. And then, even though we haven't spoken so far much about the dynamic setting where agents appear and disappear over time, if one has a decentralized setting with forced exploration, then one really has trouble whenever an agent appears or disappears. Basically, one would need to broadcast, hey, some agent left, a new agent joined, we need to restart the protocol. And even if one was willing to do that, that's sort of wasteful, because if you have 100 agents and one of them leaves, or one of them and one new agent joins, it would be sort of wasteful to restart learning entirely. So we would like something that is more adaptive sort of than that. And in particular, the natural way to doing so would be to run max weight, but rather than running it on mu_ij, which we don't know, or running it on mu_ij hat, which would be the empirical mean of service probabilities that we have observed, we will run it on mu_ij tilde, which is an upper confidence bound on qi for server j. So this looks very similar to the UCB algorithm in bandit learning. One issue that occurs is that we have the interference. So with forced exploration, we can receive unbiased estimates for service probability. In this case here, where we want to have adaptive exploration, there's sort of this consistent issue of, I don't know when I don't receive service, whether that is because I was not selected by the server, or whether I should treat this as an unsuccessful service attempt. So basically, if you think about the Nij, that sort of appears in the denominator of mu_ij hat, which is the number of times that we've tried a particular server as qi, that Nij should only count the number of times that the server actually selected us, not all the times that the queue selected the server. Now, with UCB exploration, with forced exploration, that is fairly easy to do. With UCB exploration, we cannot control when a server selects an agent. But fortunately, we know that we have our epoch algorithm that has a particular structure where we know over long stretches of time that the matching of who requests service where is going to be constant. So during the converge time, we're not going to select any samples at all. But then during the commit phase, we know that each server only provides service to one agent at a time. Like over the course of the commit phase, a server will either not provide service to any agents, or they will provide service to the same agent throughout. Now, in order to ensure that our estimates are unbiased, we only collect the samples, meaning only count towards our Nij from the first success during commit onwards. And we then collect all the samples after that first success. Meaning, if in period 3 we have a success of the period 3 of the commit phase, so for example, here, then we would not count this one here. We would only count these here, both with respect to the numerator, meaning the number of successes, and with respect to the denominator, meaning the number of trials. Okay, so this gives us an unbiased sample collection and allows us to combine the decentralized auction mechanism with UCB learning. And our main result ends up being that if we run this algorithm and all agents follow it, then we obtain a bounded time averaged queue length. Now, how do we obtain that result? We need to incorporate sort of the error from UCB in our queuing analysis. To do so, we define a Lyapunov function, similar to what we would do for max weight. So for max weight, what we would do is we would define this Lyapunov function. We would write it as a telescoping sum. We would use the bound that we obtain on the drift from max weight. And then we would say, well, by traffic slackness, this term here, this is just a rewriting, this term here is at most this here. And then we can pull that to the other side and divide through by t and basically obtain something that that has a Q length that would be time average, something like 2k divided by epsilon. This would be max weight if we just ran max weight as we can. But unfortunately, we cannot because we're running max weight with UCB. So what changes with UCB? Rather than having a maximum weight matching in each period, we now have some matching that is almost a maximum weight matching, except for it's based on the UCB exploration. And that means that this mu I sigma I star that we had before is now just a mu I sigma I star is now a mu I sigma I rather than a sigma I star. Now, we can similarly bound it to before, but we'll be left with this one term here, which is sort of the difference between the maximum weight matching, the difference in weight between the maximum weight matching and the matching that we've identified. Now, this looks pretty innocuous. In particular, it looks a little bit like a regret term in multi-armed bandit settings. And in multi-armed bandit settings, it is actually innocuous because as long as you don't have many errors, since the error bound in every step is bounded, since the error that you incur, the regret that you incur in each period is bounded, you also know that as long as you don't have too many errors, your loss won't blow up. In our case, it's a bit trickier because our error changes with time. So if we make an error in a period where Qi of t is small, it's fine. But if we make an error in a period where Qi of t is very large, then this term here is not necessarily bounded. So that is the part that we need to get around. And the way we do that is through a last technical idea, which is a smoothing of errors. So what we do is we basically rewrite our Q length, or we upper bound our Q length by saying, well, Qi of t is at most Qi of t minus 1 plus 1, because in each period, the Q length increases by at most 1. So in particular, if we look at the last h periods for some number h that will be set roughly number of errors divided by epsilon lambda 1, but like for the moment, think of just any h. So if you look at the last h periods, in each of these periods, the Q length increased by at most 1. So if you take the average Q length over those h periods, that is at most h below Qi of t. So in particular, that average plus h is an upper bound on the Q length. There's nothing magical happening here, right? Like this is not because of how we set h. This is a very, very basic upper bound. But this allows us to smooth the errors by looking at the term that we have, which is this difference in weight between the maximum weight and the weight of our matching. And then we can say, well, this term is only greater than 0 if there is an error at all. So then we have a sum over our time periods of basically Qi of t times the indicator of there being an error. Then we can replace Qi of t by this upper bound. And what's nice about this upper bound is that h times the indicator of the errors, h is just basically a constant. So you can think of that as turning into the number of errors squared divided by epsilon lambda I. So where does this come from? The indicator is equal to 1 by definition in the number of periods in which there's an error. Multiply this by number of errors divided by epsilon lambda 1. So that's the purple term. And the red term actually turns into something that looks like epsilon lambda 1 times the sum of the expected Q length. This is a very loose upper bound, actually. Now, if you look at this, this is much more amenable to our Lyapunov analysis because the right-hand side separates out one term that is based on the Q length and one term that is based on the number of errors. And this is much more amenable to sort of rearrange terms in the way that we want for our analysis here than it would be to have this term here, the purple term here, which has errors that change with time. And this then allows us to obtain the upper bound on the expected time average Q length over time. If we try this numerically, we actually find that this also works very well. So on these plots here, you see 6 different algorithms implemented. One is just max weight. And as you can see across all of the systems that we study, max weight vastly dominates. So max weight is just at the bottom, and that is not something worth comparing to. But then we consider DAM with forced exploration, DAM UCB, which is the adaptive exploration, DAM.K, which is if you implement the decentralized auction mechanism, but you assume that you know the arrival rates. And what you see for those is sort of like across the board, DAM UCB is basically as good, or at least pretty quickly as good as DAM K is. DAM FE, DAM forced exploration, is much slower at converging to the same sort of level. This is on the left-hand side, by the way. Sorry, I'll get to the right-hand side in a second. And existing algorithms, like if you just use expert 3, which is what's used in the Gaitonde and Tadeusz paper, in which agents are assumed to be selfish, that may diverge. So you may have Q lengths that blow up. And if you look at the Adekra algorithm, which is the one in the Centenac et al. Paper, there you also find that converges eventually. And in fact, usually it converges to something better than what we converge to, but eventually is very far-fetched future. So you really need to run it for significantly longer than we've basically run most of our instances to see a convergence where it actually comes down. And then on the right-hand side, we consider sort of the setting where Qs disappear. And you see DAM UCB sort of is indifferent to the disappearance of a Q. And DAM FE, if disappearances are frequent, which is what's the case in the first example, there you see it diverge. If disappearances are very, very rare, then DAM FE does fine. But sort of across the board, you see DAM UCB, the adaptive exploration, really paying off relative to forced exploration. Okay, so to summarize, we developed these 2 new algorithmic ideas. On the one hand, the decentralized auction mechanism that allows us to converge to an approximate maximum weight matching decentrally. And we then show how to incorporate adaptive exploration using UCB into this queuing setting. For arbitrary unknown service probabilities, if all agents follow this algorithm, we obtain a bounded time average Q length. And this continues to hold even when agents dynamically join and or leave, which would not be possible with forced exploration. There are various sort of open directions that remain from here. For the decentralized learning and curing sort of more broadly, but also for our specific setting. One issue that we find is that we have a gap in our time average queue length from decentralization, which is what we obtain is an asymptotic time average queue length of k cubed divided by epsilon cubed. If we just used max weight, we would obtain k divided by epsilon. This sort of begs the question if this is fundamental to decentralization or just us not having worked hard enough. A lower bound in that regard that says, well, with decentralization, here's the best you can do. That would be a really interesting sort of result. And of course, improving our gap from k cubed to epsilon to the cube to k squared over epsilon squared or whatever it may be would also be interesting. Other tie-breaking rules. So what do I mean by tie-breaking rules? We assume that the agents are allowed to put in arbitrary bits and the server will always take the maximum bit. That is sort of still a bit communication heavy because each agent needs to like actually communicate a bit. So there's a question if that could be somehow reduced. From a learning perspective, it would be interesting if we could get around the knowledge of the service probabilities and also the knowledge of the traffic slackness. If we don't assume knowledge of the traffic slackness, then we would need to fundamentally change the algorithm in terms of currently we're thinking about an epoch-based algorithm. And without knowledge of the traffic slackness, it would be very hard to think about what would the algorithmic design look like. In that regard, a related question, how about a completely asynchronous algorithm? So we were really trying for quite a bit to come up with an algorithm where the common clock would not be needed. And it would be nice to have that because true decentralization should not involve the common clock. But that makes the interference really difficult to deal with. And we have not been able to sort of get around this. And then the last very natural question, of course, is can we go beyond just bipartite queuing systems to more complicated types of stochastic networks? I will stop here with a poem written not by me, but by ChatGPT. And thank you all for the attention. And I'm happy to take any questions or let Wentao take any questions.
Thanks, Daniel, for a very clear talk. Do we have any questions from the audience? So I actually do have a question. So if not sure how this will play out in the learning setting, but a common regime that people study in this parallel server system is some kind of a heavy traffic regime. Well, it imposes some assumptions on the parameters, and then oftentimes people look at this complete resource pooling setting. And max weight is kind of, in this regime is heavy traffic optimal. And then because the algorithm tries to imitate max weight in a way, understand that in simulation, there's a big gap. What's your sense of, how optimal the algorithm that you propose is going to be, let's say, in a complete resource pool setting?
So my best answer would be the gap is exactly the k over epsilon versus k cubed over epsilon cubed. So I'd say that's a pretty large gap. And my belief would be, on the one hand, given the sort of things that we impose with respect to decentralization, it's hard to believe that you can do as well as max weight. But on the other hand, I do think you could improve on what we're doing. Wentao, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I guess one part in our model is that we also involve learning. And it's hard to define a metric in heavy traffic that's meaningful when there's learning. Because for all those heavy traffic optimality results, you look at asymptotic or stationary regime where learning does not make sense.
I see. So I mean, so like in these heavy traffic proofs, you usually have like a well, people do this kind of state space class. One way, there were multiple ways to do it, right? One way to do it is they consider like patches of kind of fully scaled time horizon, and then that is usually a pretty big time horizon compared to, for example, the epochs that you have here, I think. So you may be able to achieve kind of instantaneous learning, you know, in these fully scaled time intervals. And so kind of one question I have is, you know, following on that, do you think that kind of the gap to max weight comes more from decentralization, or do you think it comes more from learning? Is there a way to kind of separate those two effects? Let's say that, you know, there's a gap because of decentralization and there's a gap because of learning.
Yeah. If we go to the graph,
The gap does come basically from the two parts separately. So
okay.
asymptotically, the gap is really the k cubed over epsilon cubed. And that's what you would get already, when Tao, correct me if I'm wrong, that's what you would get already if you just had the decentralization, at least in the way that we do it. We don't have any evidence that this is best possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dave.
Hey.
Hey, man.
Good to see you, man. It's a very nice result. A question. So a lot of the past work where there were exponential Q lengths, or it seemed like some of the other CSMA techniques like didn't lead to poly-size Qs. They were working on models where it was like independent sets define the interference, and right for independent sets, like Markov chains aren't going to mix well generally, and I guess for matchings they do. And so I wonder, like, or at least in a lot of settings, have you thought about, or what's the connection between the results that you all have and kind of versus the old way of thinking, where it's just if the natural kind of simple decentralized Markov chains mix rapidly, then would the old approaches work? And it's just the fact that they were concerning themselves with independent sets for whatever reason and not matchings? Or because especially if you're interested in general matchings, since, right, like Markov chains can sample from general matchings, like simple chains can in poly time, I guess. How would you think about that, or have you thought about that?
So I think when Tao will have a smart answer, but let me start with a non-smart answer. So part of the answer, I think, is that relative to these models, we sort of assume both more and less with respect to what is allowed. So in particular, one thing that these models assume is that there's sort of like not interference, there's interference, but there's not interference in the way where we mean it, which is that in these models, you know if you're not being served. And also with respect to learning in these models, you know, like the learning that needs to happen is sort of learning of like what is really learning in our commit sense, and not learning in the sense of like what is the service probability or the service rate. So that's sort of like a difference where what we do is more difficult. At the same time, in those models, collisions are treated much more harshly. So in our model, if two queues request the same server, one of them doesn't get served, but there's still like service is not lost because one of the two gets selected by the server, and that's what the server works on. In those models, the service would just be lost. So in that, sorry, go ahead.
Fair enough. Maybe before Wento answers, let me just jump in with kind of like a refinement there, which is like, So, okay, that's like a very in the weeds answer of like specific things. I guess my question was more just at a very high level. My vague understanding was a key reason why the past simple methods didn't have polyton Q lengths was because simple Markov chains didn't mix rapidly there or not rapidly enough. Maybe that intuition is wrong, but if that intuition is correct, then even for general matchings, there might be a thought that all you really need is the separation of timescales thing, and rapid mixing would be enough for that. Your approach of looking at it through the lens of the auction algorithm also achieves that in a very nice way. But for general matchings, just maybe, and I mean, I know there's some old work that makes some connections between if things mix, then some things work out, but I don't know exactly what that was showing. So Wento, what are your thoughts on that? Just high level thought.
Yeah, I think high level, from a high level point of view, their focus is on stability, so they can focus on the separation of time scale, so they don't care about finite time Q length bound. But here we want to have some exact finite understanding of the Turing system. So we have a more accurate characterization based on the auction mechanism rather than the Markov chain sampling technique.
Okay.
That being said, I like.
That's fair.
Yeah, I was gonna like. I do think it could be a fruitful direction, but if I'm honest, I don't have a real good sense whether or not it would go through. I think it's an interesting idea. We haven't really played with it.
Okay, that's it, I think. Okay, thanks, guys.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's thank the speaker and then Wentao again. Well, I'll stick around for a few minutes. So if anyone feel like to chat a little bit more, feel free to stay. Yeah, but otherwise, we'll formally end the seminar here. Yeah. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah.
Hey, Ali Reza.
Hey, Daniel, great talk.
Thanks. I wasn't fishing for compliments. I was really just saying hi.
A simple question though. So you had this assumption that jobs are done like instantaneously. What if they take like, I don't know, an exponential time or something?
So in a sense they do, right? So like if you think about let me actually jump back about 100 slides. I guess, yeah, good enough. If you think about the commits period, let's say the commit phase is 1,000 periods long, and my service rate is 1/10, then roughly 100 jobs will get served, right? So on the one hand, yes, we do very much rely on the fact that like in each period, a job can get done or not. But at the same time, the service rate does introduce at least a version of what you're describing as it takes an exponential amount of time for the job to complete.
Yeah, I get it. Also, do you have any thoughts on what would happen if the agents are strategic? Then this max bit would not go through anymore.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, we do, because that's, I mean, basically part of the motivation originally came exactly from Jason and Eva's paper, where they were saying, well, if agents are strategic, then you may not get stability where otherwise you would have. I think their first result was you end up with requiring twice as much capacity. And then they had a refined result that's like under some conditions, it's only epsilon divided by epsilon minus 1 times more capacity that is needed. But either way, we know that if agents are strategic, then you end up with requiring strictly more capacity to get stability. At the same time, given that you and I have a paper that looks at price of anarchy and price of stability, one way to think about it would be the price of anarchy is very high because the queue length ends up arbitrarily large. The price of stability, it's not quite price of stability, but it's close enough to basically say, if every agent sort of like sticks to the protocol, then things then you get the bounded queue length, and then there's relatively little improvement that's attainable by deviating. I'm emphasizing relatively little because it's not zero, so it's not, I guess in the sense of our paper as well, it's an epsilon price of stability maybe. Or I guess to be precise, a k cubed over epsilon cubed price of stability.
Yeah, gotcha. Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
Another question, Daniel, just like, I think at some point I like figured it out, but I'm forgetting now. Like, why is it again that like just the kind of free exploration concept from Ramesh's paper doesn't apply in the asymmetric case, just like at a high level?
Doesn't apply, say again, please.
I mean, I guess the whole premise is because you are in the asymmetric case, somehow free exploration is no longer enough or relevant, and just like, why is that? Like, why do naive kind of learning things not work here, just at a high level?
I think they are on a high level. On a high level, Ramesh has the structural assumption, which is basically that for every queue, there's a unique server that is the optimum. So if you think about the max weight, if you ignore any sort of weighting, if you ignore even the learning, which is a bit silly, but let's ignore it.
Yeah.
Then you would just stick with the same matching throughout. Because every queue has a unique optimal server and like.
Oh, I see. Wait,
and in our
separate from the queue lengths?
Say again?
Separate from the queue lengths?
Independent of the queue length. Yeah.
So Ramesh is looking at a setting where the queue lengths don't matter, you're saying? I'm not sure. I could.
Yeah, my understanding of the paper would be that because of that structural assumption, the queue length basically does not matter.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Or I mean, I guess maybe it's because the decentralization. I mean, even separate from what Ramesh did or whatever, there's all kinds of really silly ways one could think one could just naively learn the service times or service rates or whatever, right? Just like you observe them somehow because things get observed over time and you somehow learn them. And that's good enough as long as you're strictly in the matching polytope somehow. You guys have developed a very sophisticated, I mean, a very nice, but like really sophisticated way. Like the jump in complexity between Ramesh's paper and your analysis is substantial. That's
so you're totally, so let's be honest. I think you're completely right that like the decentralization aspect is I would say responsible for most of the complexity gap between what Ramesh does and what we do.
So is that like, I mean, I guess at a high level, the confusion is like, and maybe one of the past questions gets at this too. I mean, decentralization is interesting in its own right. And of course, there's a large literature on this in CSMA algorithms and whatever. The learning is interesting in its own right. Is it really the case that the only path to like closing Ramesh's question about learning was through decentralization? Or is that plausibly not the case? And like, you developed this very interesting kind of machinery and approach, but if the only goal was answering Ramesh's kind of question about going beyond the symmetric case, probably all the insights about decentralization, which are interesting in their own right, were plausibly not necessary.
Let me answer in three pieces. First, we have removed both from the paper and from the slides that we're answering the open question. The open question was a very specific gap between forced and adaptive exploration that they found in their exact model. And we do not close that gap. We had misunderstood we thought it was sort of a general, what is the value of adaptive exploration in queuing? So like, first answer is, I just want to clarify, we've removed
What
that.
about the symmetric versus, I thought there was, am I totally, maybe I misunderstood a past thing. I thought they only look at a symmetric case. No.
I think
I don't even know, why would I have gotten that? I don't know why I would have got that in my mind then. That I apologize.
No worries at all. We did previously falsely claim closing, like answering an open question. So like that, but
Was it about symmetric versus asymmetric?
No, it was about forced versus adaptive.
Okay, then I just created something out of nothing. Okay.
That being said, the follow-up directions that Theodoros Ventaro and I are now pursuing are exactly about the non-decentralized learning part. And what is the right way of thinking about learning in, like, I think what we're thinking about now is actually a more immediate follow-up to Ramesh's paper than the paper that I presented today.
I mean, what's the minimal property you need to have the learning part go through? Like what conceptual thing do you need? I assume it's not decentralization per se. What is it that you need? You need a robustness, you need a what?
I'm not sure I really
What is it about the decentralization that facilitates the learning? I assume that the proofs could be largely separated, and in the learning thing, there's probably one thing you need that decentralization gets.
So actually, like, I mean, if you think, if you have a look at like this bit here,
okay,
this wasn't actually, like, this was incorporating UCB exploration to max weight. It was not incorporating UCB exploration into decentralized auction mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
In the paper, of course, we do, because we want to have a guarantee for decentralized auction mechanism, but you're exactly right. So like this here already, so this here for the Ramesh setting would give a queue length bound that holds without forced exploration, and that holds without any structural assumptions about symmetry, asymmetry. I mean, the assumption that they do have, if I remember it correctly, it was not symmetry or asymmetry. It was this: every queue has a unique best server.
okay.
So like this would also not be needed here.